Welcome to the Help We Need podcast, where we explore topics that empower women and support their well-being. I am your host, Fumike Keji, and today we are tackling again salary negotiations, a topic that most women shy away from fear of retaliation or punishment, or not wanting to be seen as ambitious, or probably they're unsure and don't necessarily think this is the right thing to do. But I think it's important that you first of all establish that if you're working and you are underpaid, underline the word underpaid, and you know that you're underpaid, you need to do something about it. I do hope you've listened to the first and second parts of this series on self-preparation tips for salary negotiation. In the first part of this series, we talked about you negotiating your salaries, and we described this from a not yet ready scenario perspective. In the second part of this series, we also talked about how to tackle the salary negotiation conversations. But in this episode, we talked about I'm ready, yes, scenario. And this episode that we spoke to was about considering, for starters, you're just new to the conversation and you're wondering, should I be doing this? Or you're not just ready for whatever reasons. And you need to come up with a baseline. You need to enhance your skill sets. You need to have a form of value proposition, right? To even start up the conversations. Otherwise, what are we talking about here? The not yet ready scenario addresses that. And then in terms of how you get yourself prepped up to discuss the salary upgrade with your manager, that's where I am ready, yes scenario pops up. Okay, so in a sense, if you've not listened to those two episodes, please go back to listen to the tips that I shared there, and I believe that they will be helpful and they would help set a good foundation for getting you ready to take action and to have this crucial discussion in a smart way. So in a specific, in a measurable, an achievable, realistic, and time-bound way. And just to be able to provide some context, we know as women, sometimes, or most times, when we talk about salary negotiation conversations, we're not necessarily there yet, okay? So the essence of our series is to prepare you to get to a level that you're confident to do this, and hopefully, it helps along the way, right? So for today's episode, we will tackle part 3 of this series. And in this part 3, we will be talking about how to do it scenario. We'll be looking at taking the conversation another step further. And I know by now you should be more than confident to get the ball rolling. So I will be sharing some tips on how to execute on today's episode in an efficient manner. So we focus on building the needed structure for the conversation with your manager, your supervisor, your employer. Who knows? Any scenario could work as a woman. You could even leverage these tips to have a conversation with your husband in terms of how do we review the pocket money. Some people call it, my money, my allowance, whatever it is that terminologies you use. And how could we up that up a bit, given that the economy is changing? So as a woman, you don't have to be intimidated if you're not in the working space as we're having these conversations. It applies to all aspects, or all areas that we are currently positioned. Whether you're working, whether you're not working, whether you're self-employed, whether you're a homemaker, I'm sure you'll be able to leverage these tips. So let's get started. So our first tip for self-preparation for the salary negotiation discussion is addressing potential bias. So what are we speaking to here? What do we mean by potential bias? So in a sense, you may have observed that there is a bias that you strongly have. And I wouldn't call it unconscious bias now, because now you're aware, right? You know, as a person, as a woman, you're uncomfortable around even having a conversation on this particular topic. And it could be a bias within the organization, company itself. You've noticed that there is this culture, it's probably a silent one. Maybe it's where women are supposed to be quiet. And maybe it's a bias, within the location or the country you live in, where it is not expected that women take up roles in senior roles in organizations. So this bias obviously would come from either your culture, your upbringing, the society, the organization you're in. And, it seeps into how we relate with one another and how we behave. So it's important as you embark on having this conversation, you first tackle what's your bias? What is that thing that is mostly standing out for you as a woman that makes you want to shy away from having this conversation? And the reason that we are, bringing this home and, near to something that I think it's important that we reflect upon is because if you don't address this bias, it's going to show up during the conversation. It's going to show up in the way that you're talking, that you keep on apologizing. Oh, I'm so sorry, I'm bringing this up. Please avoid apologizing for asking for a salary increase where you know that either your counterparts are getting more money or paid more than you, or you're doing a job that it's over and beyond and you're underpaid. Why? I just wonder why as women we often apologize, and it comes across to us as, oh, I know I shouldn't be doing this, but no. So the first thing to address is face those unconscious biases. What are they? Identify what it is so that you can maintain a professional tone. This is really important because it's going to show up. So that you can focus on facts, and please avoid apologizing for asking. So that's the first important thing that I think needs to be addressed. And I think oftentimes as well, it might be helpful also to point out that sometimes the bias could come from, and I think it's our perception that my manager should know that I am doing twice as much. I am so hardworking. I'm putting in so much. But you're not in your manager's head. So while it may seem as if your manager should know, remember that the essence of having the conversations is to clarify or to make him aware or her aware that this is something that, has come to your attention and this is how you feel about it. And it's not just about emotions or feeling, it's about the data. This is what data says. This is what research says. This is what the analysis says. And I am asking for a raise to be compensated for extra work or the work I currently do. So that's the reason for the conversation, not for us to assume that my manager should know. And I think sometimes, it seeps through our body language because we may come across as aggressive, upset about it. And it's almost like, why do I even need to have this conversation? And I get that. And sometimes, or most times, we would expect to live in an ideal world, but the reality is we're not living in an ideal world, right? And we need to explore ways to define what ideal means for us and work within that framework. So I think it's important for you to check that. And this conversation is to create awareness. This conversation is to, communicate your thoughts, your expectations around the salary package. And hopefully your manager is able to get you, understand what you're saying, and you come to a dialogue. So it's important to have that at the back of your mind so that all the cross-pollination around, oh, they should know, why am I even having this conversation? And, it's so upsetting that I'm even saying this. Yeah, but you need to say it, right? It's important to say this because at the end of the day, your goal is the increase in the salary. So focus on the goal and avoid any form of distraction. And, I said the other time that we often apologize a lot for so many things. So it's important for you to understand this is why I'm having the conversation. I don't need to apologize for having this conversation, and not in a rude way or anything, just in a soft voice. You keep your face up, your chest straight, you're smiling, and you're making the best of the conversation, or you're using assertive and confident language. Say, for example, you could say, based on my contributions and market research, I believe my compensation should reflect so and so, in addition to the data points I just shared with you. Or I see that there's a differential of this percentage. I would expect X percentage in terms of, ensuring that I come up to par with the salary benchmark. So it's really important to reflect this in a way that is factual and it's not sipped into any emotions. As much as possible, just stick to the facts. So I hope that was helpful. Now, the second tip is being able to choose an appropriate time for the discussion. And I believe that timing is everything. Timing is everything in life, because if you don't get it done at the right time, then you may miss that window of opportunity. So when we talk about timing, you are in the organization, you're in that space where you work. You understand the dynamics. Hopefully you're keeping your ears close to what's going on. So the right timing would be such a time as a performance review, or you've achieved something very significant and your boss is very happy, you just won a bid, I don't know what you do, but your contributions is really out there and everybody's super excited about either the revenue, either the savings, either what you've done for your team, your department, and your manager is, very impressed. This is such a time when you should be leveraging this momentum to have the conversation. Or within your organization that, it's time to do the budget planning. Because sometimes, and we will get to this in a bit, oftentimes managers will come up and say, oh, sorry, we should have had this discussion earlier because there's no budget for it. So when the budget planning, you understand, is happening, this is the time to quickly have those conversations so that your manager hopefully can factor that into the budget planning. So I hope that's helpful. So we're going to move on to our third tip for, holding the conversation scenario. And it's around crafting your pitch, right? So we've just spoke at length as to identifying the potential bias that we may have, and just ensuring that, there's a saying that you're not guilty until you're innocent until you're proven guilty, right? So you need to make sure that your perception of your manager is something that, at least when you have that conversation, then, you have a clearer picture. And then we've spoken obviously about the right timing. So now is crafting your pitch. How am I going to do this in the most efficient way is what you need to start thinking about. You understand your manager. By now, I would assume you would be able to understand their personality. You'd be able to gauge the room. But more importantly, what we're trying to do now is structure the conversation. So in terms of the opening, you start with gratitude, thank him or her for the opportunity, for the meeting, acknowledge the positive aspects of your role. And then obviously you move on to, presenting your data, your research, the benchmark in terms of how the salary is looking from a market perspective or an industry perspective. You emphasize your achievements, the years you've been in role, where applicable, without a raise to continue to buttress your point. And obviously, you need to also speak to evidence to support why you're asking for an increase. So I think this is really important. And obviously, whilst you're doing this, I think it's important to frame your conversations as a win-win, highlighting your contributions to the organization or your employer's goals, and not just for that point in time, but for what you hope that you will continue to support your team and department with. And then wait for your manager to respond. You don't go on and on and on and on. And I know for some managers, if you may just completely tip them off if you just keep on talking and don't give them an opportunity to respond to what you're saying. So you need to read the room. You need to read the body language, because you're looking at your manager, you're having this conversation. Once you are done, then you wait for your manager, obviously, to respond and have them react to what you said, or maybe explain if they have questions or they're not clear about what you've said. So that's probably from a crafting, framing, how am I going to have this conversation perspective? This is what is really very important. Now, moving on to the fourth tip, and that is, how would you then navigate the conversation? So we've talked obviously about, you start with gratitude. You need to, the key points around presenting your research, and emphasizing your achievements, and then framing the conversations. So with the real dialogue itself, in terms of the conversation with your manager, it goes without saying, you open the dialogue, you greet them, you thank them for their time, and, you talk around the value that you're bringing to the role, and then you speak to the desired salary range. And, hopefully this shouldn't be an overkill. And what I mean by an overkill is, it depends on the circumstance, right? If you're someone, hopefully, that is starting this conversation for the first time, I think it's also important to ensure that you're asking for something that is realistic, right? And that would not fall through the cracks. So it's not something that's going to just through your manager and like, what in the world? But again, if the data and the benchmark say something extremely high, you can just share that this is what data says. You're currently on this package, you're open to their thoughts. So just giving the opportunity to appear flexible, but not say anything yet. This is what the data says. I know this is what I'm being paid at the moment, and I'm open to your thoughts on this. So it's important to not be too rigid as you come up and allow your manager obviously to respond to that. And being ready to counter is your greatest strategy ever. Hopefully the conversation, tilts in your favor, and sometimes it may not necessarily be everything you requested for. You may, your manager may meet you halfway. And in such situations, if you're offered less than expected, then, ask about growth opportunities and milestones that could probably lead to future increases. Don't just leave it like that and say, oh, finally, at least I got something, and just stay mute or be so upset depending on the circumstances, and, not express that appreciation for even the little that was provided. But be ready to counter the offer in a way that is, I would say, be diplomatic, is probably what I would say. And look for ways to, you're coming with a monetary value proposition, but you need to understand that your salary, your compensation comes with both perks and benefits. So think ahead of what are the things, I could leverage and, and balance it out a bit. And if obviously you're given less, you could ask for those other growth opportunities and milestones that could lead to future increases where there's a possibility. And I guess we'll speak to more details in terms of the balancing later on in our podcast. And I think more importantly, it's important to stay calm, approach the conversation with patience and, professionalism, even when you are met with resistance. It's not a boxing ring. You need to understand that your manager is also an employee, and maybe they also have not received an increase. So you need to be able to balance things out to be able to gauge and manage the pushback, right? So be careful how you object to them being resistant, and just try to understand the reasons for their objection. So an important skill here is listening. To be able to understand, help me understand. Could you clarify this a bit more? I'm trying to get a sense of why you would feel this way. You need to understand why they're saying, for example, not yet, no, or later. And then our fifth tip would be what you finally come to agree to, because there are most likely would be a bit of back and forth, conversations, clarifications here and there. And I think it's important for you to plan to be able to understand how you would manage, the closing, I wouldn't say arguments, but what you would agree on as moving forward. So you need to clarify if there are any additional benefits or perks being offered, like I spoke to earlier on. So you're coming from a monetary perspective, you also need to know that there is also an aspect to your position within the organization or the benefits that come with your role in the organization that they may not necessarily be, monetary. So for example, your flexible working arrangements, like I could work twice at home and not maybe 5 days a stretch in the office. Could there be bonuses? So say, for example, your manager is not particularly keen on that. You could speak to, could this be an opportunity for a higher bonus, when that time comes for bonuses to be paid? So these are things you need to think about. That how would that, and that's why it's called a salary negotiation conversation, right? To be able to have a full picture of what your package looks like and how you can, negotiate to position you in the best way possible. And then it's also important to reconfirm what has been said. So If this is what has been agreed on, you reconfirm, and more importantly, you still maintain your enthusiasm, for continuing in your role. And, I love this job. It's something I'm passionate about. I'm very excited to come to work every day. Hopefully you are. And I look forward to continue to do the best I can, add value to the team, grow in the role, and obviously leverage your support to make this position or role that I'm working in something that I can, grow up or grow into and expand maybe into another role that it could be managerial, and just making sure that your pitch is crafted in a way that you're recognizing that your manager is instrumental to your growth in the organization and you value their support. As much as you're trying to get them to help you review your benefits that currently you feel that is, makes you feel undervalued, you need to also understand that it's a team effort, right? It's a collaboration. You need your manager more than anything, because there's one thing to have the conversation. There's another thing to have that conversation in a way that your manager sees that you trust them and that they hold your back. At least that's how hopefully the conversation, tends to, and that you value their help and their support as you grow in role. So the key points to remember is, preparation. You need to prepare. Preparation is your superpower. You need to know your value. You need to understand the industry benchmarks, because in a sense, it builds your confidence. And also you need to understand that your confidence will show. So own your achievements, present yourself assertively, and focus on value, right? So I like the tangible contributions that you're making to the team, to the organization, and even in terms of future potentials, right? What you can continue to support the team to do. And another thing is professionalism, right? Every time that wins. No matter how the conversation, goes, please stay composed and gracious throughout the process, because your manager will not forget that. They may not necessarily like the way the conversations evolved, especially if you're doing this for the first time. There's an element of surprise. So you need to understand that should not be lost on you. This is not a conversation that maybe your manager may have anticipated, especially if you're someone not to speak about things like this. And remember, we're prepping to be able to do this. So it's going to be sort of a surprise for your manager. So, and when there is change, people respond in different ways. So just be mindful of that. To ensure that you're staying professional at all times. And then obviously, no matter how the conversation goes, ladies, send a thank you note, and more importantly, confirm what's been agreed in writing, just to help with memory loss. If there's ever such a situation, at least there's something that you can always refer to. And within the context of our dynamics as women and maybe the current positioning we are. So say, for example, if your role is not one that requires that you send an email, you need to still thank your manager, your boss, your supervisor, or your husband for their support. So it's really important that you come across as very appreciative. And, it's a win-win, remember? So, I can't oversay this. Salary negotiations, they're not easy conversations, yes, but they are doable. And again, they're not just about numbers, though money matters, obviously. We need money for life, but your ability to speak up is really very important, because you're advocating for your wants and you're setting the tone. for your future professional growth. So this is really something that you need to sit with, and you need to understand that, yay, why I went out and did the benchmark, and I found out that, I am really, really undervalued because of the low pay. You also need to understand that you're bringing value to the role, and having that conversation, in a sense, is a testament to your ability to be able to speak up for yourself and bring people up to speed. Most times it's just ignorance, maybe, and maybe not most times, but sometimes people are not aware, or people are just taking you for granted. You would always do it. But more importantly, if you're really contributing, you're a high potential employee, your manager would not want to lose you. So be mindful that in addition to having these conversations with your manager, you really need to hone your space in the sense that it is very clear that you're bringing value to the role, that your contributions to the organization is felt, and it's something that is not a pushover or a walkover either. So, because this is important to be able to balance the conversation of, this is what I'm asking for, or you need to understand that it has to be commensurate, right, with what you're given. So like any business or any exchange, it's just like you're going to the market, for example, or you're in a supermarket, or you want to get something. You don't just get in and pick the worst thing off the shelf, do you? No. You look for something you like, and obviously you look at the price tag to make sure that you're comfortable in that space to exchange your money for the product or the service. So I hope this episode has been helpful as we conclude this, I would say, enlightening discussion. I expect today's episode sparked not just awareness, right, but action. Because salary negotiation is more than just a conversation about numbers. I'm going to say it again, is a statement of your self-worth, is a push for your equity, and is a step towards dismantling the barriers that hold us women back, that hold you back. So whether you're entering your first salary negotiation or you are advocating for yourself at the peak of your career, please remember this. You bring immense value to the table. You deserve to be compensated accordingly. So that's very important that you know this and you believe this. And it's also important that you equip yourself with knowledge. You lean on your allies, right? Rome was not built in a day. You need to have allies within the organization that support you. And you must never underestimate the power of your voice. So let's keep the momentum going. You can do this. Subscribe to this channel to help us expand our reach and support the efforts we are putting into creating educational content and maintaining our episodes for your enrichment and empowerment. Don't forget to share this episode with a woman or a lady you know who might benefit from it. Get them to subscribe to this channel as well. And get more people to subscribe, probably, is what I'm trying to say. Because together, we can make salary negotiation a tool for empowerment and for change. Thank you for listening to the Help We Need podcast. Stay tuned in for my episodes on living your best lives. And until next time, stay empowered and remember to empower.